Yo, what's good, Time Clan? It is your boy, King Tire Next here, back after a very, very long break. Well, by my standards, that is. And, well, today we're going to be doing What If Asta was Veldora's Reincarnation. Now, before we can get started, of course, I have to give credit to Neptune for helping me with this part. And another thing is, well, you guys see the intro. Well, the new intro that is, and that was made by another content creator. And you guys may be questioning why it says Lord Titan. That's because it's also my Discord name as well. I'll leave the link to the content creators information in the description below. Now let's get on to the what if. In this timeline, well, let's see. Rimuru, as we all know him, well, he never existed. Rather, he was never reincarnated, at least into Veldora's world. Without Rimuru, Veldora, he would find himself trapped within that prison for several more years, bored and lonely most of the time. This lack of interaction with other forms of life would actually be the downfall of Veldora. It would cause for him to become delusional, talking to people that weren't really there, simply figments of his imagination. His suffering, it would just eventually be put to an end one day though, with the presence of one of his siblings, Velzard. This was the last person Veldora wanted to see right now. He was content with talking to his imaginary friends after all. Honestly, at this point, he was having a hard time telling what was fake from what was real. He was having a very hard time grasping reality due to the amount of years he had been in solitude. But when Velzard appeared, he really wasn't in the mood to see her. Velzard would actually get rid of the barrier that was holding her little brother, but Veldora, he wouldn't be all that happy about it. Rather, he would just glare at his older sister. He knew all too well that she wasn't simply doing this out of the kindness of her heart. He would be right in believing this though, because right after, Velzard would go on to be the one to, well, take his life. This would apparently be her form of disciplinary action, and this wasn't even the first time she had done it either. Velzard knew all too well that he would be reincarnated, so it would only be a matter of time for her to hear about her little brother once again. Well, she only hoped that this new life of his would actually involve him behaving better than he ever did in this life. She would be right in believing this, as his latest reincarnation would actually be in the form of a baby with ash blonde hair and gold eyes. He was found right beside the baby boy with jet black hair and a fairly fancy necklace on the doorsteps to a church in Hargay village thousands of years later. The two boys would actually grow up with each other as foster siblings. More orphans would join the church as time went by, but these two, Asta and Yuno, those two were probably as close as two peas in the pod, really. Many of their foster siblings actually would look up to the two siblings. Well, foster siblings. Many other villagers would also be amazed with and Asta. They would just look at these two in awe most of the time. This was because of their magic. You see, Asta, he actually had storm magic, while he had wind magic. Villagers would recognize these two based off their magic alone. Many of them would find these two kids to be rather strong individuals. It was pretty ridiculous how the two could use their magic at such a proficiency from very early on, without having even gained access to their grimoires. Yeah, that was really insane, and it was more so that the villagers were just thinking about what would happen once they actually did get their grimoires. These two were going to become monsters. If they never became magical knights, they would be shocked. They would see it as wasted potential. Asta especially, in all honesty. You see, Asta, he was beloved by many of the villagers once he actually gained a hold of his storm magic, as he would often create storms to help with the growth of their crops. It was always perfect weather for Hage village once Asta had actually learned to control his magic, because originally he would, accidentally create hurricanes that would destroy a lot of their crops and buildings as well. Was Asta's rival and sparring partner. As a matter of fact, was probably the main reason why Asta was even able to accelerate his learning process in the very first place. The two would often find themselves sparring with each other, gaining a better grasp for their respective magic types as a result. While Asta, he had more abilities than in terms of just pure magic. He was more refined in his magic as a result. Asta had to focus on more things, on more properties of his magic, while all he had to really focus on was his wind manipulation. Asta had more to work with. He had less to work on, and it was basically something along these lines. It was like this. One person could be caring for a single plant, and another person would have to take care of an entire garden. Now, which one is easier? That's basically the whole thing with and Asta. This wouldn't necessarily mean that Asta was weak by any means though. Oh no, far from it, in all honesty. You see, his mana reserves, they were considered to be absurd for a commoner. It was comparable to that of a noble, in all honesty. Asta's strength was also unusually high from a very early age. By the time they would get their grimoires, the two would be well known in their village. Well, even more well known than they were already. Both Asta and would receive 4-leaf grimoires, to the shock of everyone at the ceremony. One of the people there, they would actually look on and try to snatch their grimoires using chain magic. He failed. He failed immensely. You see, as soon as Asta caught wind of this, he would immediately stop this guy. As soon as Asta realized what this guy was doing, as soon as this guy tried to grab the two at the same time, for some reason he missed Asta. And Asta, once he realized that somebody was actually trying to take his grimoire, and Yuno's own as well, he wasn't all that happy, especially since it was literally the first day of just getting his grimoire. It wasn't even an hour after he got his grimoire, as a matter of fact. that somebody was already trying to steal it from him and So Asta would be pretty reasonable in the situation and electrocute the man. He would retrieve Yuno's Grimroar afterward, not really thinking much of the guy he just defeated. The biggest concern, after all, was the magical night exams that would be happening in a couple of months. Asta had a dream, after all. Not the Martin Luther King kind of dream either. Well, sort of. This dream, you see, was to become Wizard King. Yuno also had the same exact goal. Asta's reason for wanting to even become Wizard King in the first place was not so he could impress a girl or whatever. No. You see, Asta was thinking a bit more than just that. He wanted to become Wizard King so that he could better support Hage Village, the place where he was born and raised. It was basically him giving back to his community, especially after all the destruction that he would used to do when he was a little kid, just getting a hang of his magic. That and the whole issue with, well, nobles looking down on commoners. He wanted to get rid of that stigma as well, that commoners were weak and nobles were the only people that were strong in this world. The two would go on to train, and, well, the two would go on to train for several more months. The two would be training intensely, even more than they usually had, because of the fact that they now had their grimoires. This meant that they were trying to learn even more spells at this point, trying to make sure they could catch up to the rest of their competition as soon as possible. The two, once they felt as if they were ready, they would depart from their home village months later to partake of the annual Magical Nights exam. Everyone believed that these two were just shoo-ins for at least one of the Magical Night squads. I mean, just look at what they're capable of doing, even without their grimoires. That's basically what many people were thinking about. Asta, who had the ability to create storms, while Yuno, he was able to manipulate wind to such a proficiency, it was insane by even nobles' standards. The amount of faith the villagers had in them would give Asta a sense of confidence in his own abilities. This confidence he would even exude throughout the Magical Nights exams. People would be surprised seeing that absolutely zero anti-birds were attracted to either Asta or Yuno when they arrived. Some people were being attacked by these anti-birds. Some people, they only had a few surrounding them, but it was unusual to see that there were literally none for Asta and Yuno. They believed that these kids, they had to be strong if that were the case. When the exam started, you see, Asta, he would find himself excelling in pretty much every test that he had to face. Asta wouldn't even bother flying on a broom in the first test. Rather, he would just fly on his own instead. This would give him serious points from the get-go, as it was rare for the average person to fly independent of a broom. That was something more so a magical knight would do. And even then, not all magical knights knew how to do that. They would usually have to rely on a broom in order to fly most of the time. It was usually the stronger magical knights, or more experienced, you could say, that actually knew how to fly on their own. The accuracy test. It would simply be Asta shooting lightning at all of his targets, combat would involve Asta using his pure physical strength just to break through any and all defenses of his opponent. The captains would detect that Asta didn't even use a hint of magic in his combat assessment, which that was crazy. That would be really interesting in many of their books. A lot of the captains would immediately want Asta to be part of their crews by the end of the exams when looking at everything that he was capable of doing. After seeing become part of the Golden Dawn, however, Asta would immediately mark those people off of his list of teams to join. He could care less about the status of a magical knight squad in all honesty, since he would become a wizard king regardless of his obstacles. He would tear every, and I mean every, obstacle in his path down. He would bulldoze through each and every last obstacle that was in his way. That and the name Golden Dawn, it honestly sounded kinda lame to him for a group. It just sounded like a bunch of narcissists, like a bunch of privileged kids born with a silver spoon in their mouth. He wasn't particularly interested in dealing with those types of people on a daily basis. He would imagine himself getting into a lot of fights with these people really fast if he were to actually join them. A chill would actually crawl up his back thinking of the possible consequences of doing that. He didn't know why though. He just felt as if such actions would be the death of him. He thought about the Crimson Lions since they had a pretty awesome name, and he heard a couple of things about Ray Goleon beforehand. He seemed like a fairly good dude, respecting the strength of others rather than status. He seemed like someone he could get along with, and he imagined his squad would have the same sort of ideals as him for the most part. He would consider them as a team to join, but eventually decided to go with the Black Bulls in the long run, since you could tell there was a different vibe to this Yami guy compared to the rest of the magical knight captains. He felt he could become stronger under his leadership. That and their name, the Black Bulls, that sounded legendary in his mind. Pure manliness in that name. Yeah, he could basically feel the testosterone in that name. It just sounded perfect in Asta's mind. Yami would honestly be really surprised to find that Asta would want to join his group out of all of the captains who wanted him as part of their squad. As a matter of fact, he would even laugh, saying that this kid probably made a pretty poor decision, but he liked this kid. This kid got some energy to him. He likes his spunk. Yami would have his personal taxi, Finral, escort him and Asta to the Black Bull's base, where Asta would meet the cast of characters that would be his teammates for the foreseeable future. Before Asta could be considered a Black Bull officially though, he would have to seemingly pass a sort of initiation test. This initiation test was conducted by a guy by the name of Magna. This would involve Asta having to defend himself against Magna, which would prove his strength as a Black Bull. Or maybe I should rephrase that. It would basically prove that he was strong enough to be part of the Black Bulls. Asta would do his best to avoid most of Magna's attacks and sometimes remove the air from some of the attacks as well, which would cause for the flames to disperse. He wouldn't be able to continue this though when seeing Magna create a massive fireball that couldn't simply be dodged or nullified at a fast enough rate. At this moment, Asta would try to create a storm instead with the hopes of the rain extinguishing the fire. He had his doubts, but he was willing to take the chance. Surprisingly, it worked. He felt as if the odds were stacked against him in this one though, and the probability of that actually working was closer to 30%, you could say. He wasn't really complaining though. Asta wouldn't be aware of the fact someone was watching him either. A girl with silver hair and purple eyes. Just looking at what Asta was capable of doing against Magna, she would immediately think that Asta was another royal just like her. Just going based off of the amount of mana he had and, well, the magic type he had as well. Storm magic, yeah, that was rather unusual, but powerful. Unusual but powerful. It was only befitting of a royal, but if that was the case, why was he playing the Black Bulls? Asta would be introduced to the rest of the Black Bulls after earning his right to be called a Black Bull in the first place, and have a robe made for him by Vanessa. He would get a tour of the Black Bull's hideout, and he would become ecstatic finding out he had his own room for once. Magna would be talking about how, Asta's room wasn't as big as his, but he would actually go silent seeing Asta just have tears of joy over the fact that he had his own room. Magna would honestly just sweat drop seeing this. During the tour of the Black Bull's hideout though, Asta would also be introduced to Noelle, his peer of sorts, although she didn't really even treat him like one. Magna would explain how Noelle seemingly joined the Black Bulls around the same time as Asta. Noelle would immediately brush the both of them off though, not really caring enough to even give him a form of greeting or the time of day. Asta would be confused, but Magna would explain that she's been like that to pretty much all of the Black Bulls, so he wouldn't even take it all out personally. Asta would nod his head in understanding and go on to learn more about what it meant to be a magic knight. Asta would find himself getting into several fights against Luck and Magna while part of the Black Bulls, until one day, during one of his sparring sessions against the two, he would sense a disturbance and he would head to the back of the Black Bull's hideout, only to see Noelle trapped within a sphere of water, causing mass destruction. At first he would think that this was an enemy attack and he would do his best to break her out of the bubble. He would create enough wind pressure to burst through the sphere, and he would rush over to grab Noelle. The sphere would disappear not too long after. The rest of the Black Bulls though, they would head over to Asta and Noelle's section, only to see Asta holding Noelle bridal style. Noelle would immediately become flustered when realizing the sort of position that she was in, and she would spray water at Asta's face, which would cause him to drop her. Yami would question what happened, to which Asta he would bring up his own theory, this being that an enemy must have found their hideout and they went on to attack Noelle, but Noelle, she would actually just bow her head in frustration. She would actually go on to explain what really happened. She was practicing with her magic, but she lost control of it at the last minute. Asta would laugh hearing this, and this would deeply upset Noelle, even more than she already was, believing that he was mocking her, just like her siblings. She would be surprised to hear the rest of the things from Asta, though. To hear the next words from Asta, I should say. That being, well, an offer to train her. From what he'd seen, she had an immense amount of mana, and that could be hard to control at times. He had personal experience considering how he would often create several hurricanes back home in Hage Village when he was still getting adjusted to controlling his magical output. Noelle would be confused hearing him mention Hage Village, though. Wasn't that one of the poor villages? A commoner's village where it produced potatoes and nothing more? Wasn't Asta noble like her? Although she wasn't sure which family name he was under, she was probably going to ask that one of these days, but Asta would let her know that he was actually a commoner, and he was proud to be one as well. There seemed to be a stigma against commoners, that being that they wouldn't amount to anything, and Asta was planning to prove them all wrong through becoming Wizard King. He had to admit, it wasn't going to be easy. He'd have to compete against his foster brother Yuno for this dream after all, and many other people as well, many people of which were nobles. Noelle would be at a loss for words hearing that. This completely broke her perception of life growing up. She would just walk away, needing some time to process this information, and Asta's offer to train her as well. Would it be wise to accept his offer? She wasn't really sure. She wouldn't really have much time to think about it that much either, as she would be thrown into a mission with Asta and Magna in order to deal with some rampaging boars in another village. When hearing from Yami that the origins of this mission were compiled of him apparently losing a bet against an old man, and this was their request, no one would immediately try to bail on this mission, but Asta would be down for the mission so long as he was allowed to, electrocute some of the boys and have some pork. Turn them into pork. You see, he was really in the mood for some pork today. Some pork, some bacon, all that good stuff. And this was practically the heavens just telling him that, yeah, today is a good day for pork. Yami would give Noelle the death glare, and his aura would spike up, giving the silver-haired girl goosebumps. She would immediately comply with Yami's orders right after. Yami would release his aura, and he would go back to his more relaxed state before turning to face Asta. He would think about it for a second, think about Asta's proposal, and he would give him the okay to cook the boars, so long as he didn't bring any harm to the village in the process, and, if he brought back some for Yami as well, of course. Yami would have Magna come along as the supervisor of sorts for this mission, this being because of the fact that it was their very first mission. After all, Magna was expecting for Asta to fly on a broom just like him, but he would be shocked, just like many others, when he saw the boy was capable of flying on his own. Noelle would be equally surprised, but Asta would simply be confused. He believed that it wasn't really anything all that special. It was fairly easy for him to get the hang of it after all. It was one of the first things he mastered while learning to control his magical output. Magna would just tell Asta to follow him to the village after he got over his initial state of shock. Noelle would be forced to hitch a ride on Magna's broom since she couldn't control her magical output like Asta or Magna. It was a pretty tedious flight for Magna due to how tightly she was grabbing onto him. She was incredibly nervous the whole flight. When arriving to the village, they would encounter a thick wall of mist covering the place though. Asta would see this and immediately use his magic to disperse the mist. The three would enter the village only to see what seemed to be an execution of several villagers about to happen. Several icicles were floating above them and the people were gathered in the center of the village after all. It was only natural that they were thinking that an execution was about to happen, in which Magna would rush over and neutralize the threat as fast as possible. Magna would find out the man who requested their service was also already dead at this time. He was angry now. He would demand an answer from the mages he spotted nearby, but he wouldn't get an answer from them. Rather, he would just have an irritated mage just glare at him. They were irritated at the interference Magna created. In fact, Asta would summon a storm, which would strike lightning down just a couple of feet away from Heath Grice, as he was, well, actually about to get ready to attack Magna as well. Asta would send this lightning down at Heath Grice also as his own form of threat. If they didn't want to get hit by the lightning, it would honestly be of their best interest to start talking immediately. Another mage though would actually attempt to create a mist-based attack, only for Asta to immediately disperse it. This would surprise many of them. Many other mages that were just now seeing Asta. At first they thought he had lightning magic, considering how he created a thunderstorm before. Thunderstorm, where lightning literally struck down only a couple feet away from Heath Grice. Now Asta was showing something else, showing more to his capabilities, which would confuse mages. Asta would create another thunderstorm around the mage with enough concussive force to actually knock them out this time around. Other mages would focus their attention onto Asta now. They realized that he was the biggest threat out of all of these three Black Bolt members. They would try to get rid of him as soon as possible with a conjoined attack, or just a joint attack, you could say. It basically mixed ice and mist magic together. This would create an ice spear barrage, which they would use against Asta, only for the boy to end up neutralizing the whole thing just by creating, a small tornado. Heath would be pretty livid at this moment, seeing Asta make quick work of his men as if they were child's play. He would attempt to attack Asta himself, but a glare from Asta was enough to make him remember that at any moment he could be electrocuted by this brat. It was too soon. He didn't know what would happen. If he were to just go down right now, there was a chance that maybe, just maybe, they would take in the rest of his men right then and there. And if they took in his men, they may end up interrogating them, which would cause for some of them to eventually crack. Heath had a plan in mind though. He wasn't about to just go down so quickly. If he was gonna go down, all of his men would have to go down with him. this would ensure that the information wouldn't leak out at all. So Asta would end up dragging Heath Grice to the center of the village alongside the rest of his group of mages. Magna would be the one to actually interrogate the mages here about the reason for disturbing this village after he had used a restraining spell on them. Heath, though, he would refuse to speak. Asta would threaten him with lightning once more, but this time around Heath would actually hold no fear of dying. Instead, he would realize that now would be the perfect opportunity to enact his fallback plan, you could say, or plan B, in case this were to ever fall forward, or I forget the expression at times. If the original plan fell through, he would make sure to always have this thing as a plan B, have this magical item he had stored in his stomach to use right at this moment. He would realize he was in close proximity, and in this circumstance it would be a perfect opportunity to just off himself and his subordinates rather than be brought in for interrogation by the other magical knights. If he was the only one to die, of course there would be no guarantee the others would stay silent the whole time. And so Heath Grice would at this moment use a magical item, and this would end up not only killing himself, but of course it would end up, you could say, assassinate or just kill the other mages as well, which would deeply frustrate Asta. Actually, Asta, he was frustrated over the fact that this guy was able to just get away. Technically, they weren't even able to get any sort of information off of Heath Grice or his subordinates. They could have used this guy to get some valuable information, which they could probably set up another mission of sorts in order to figure out something. If there was some sort of contractor or something, why was this village attacked in the first place? There must have been something valuable. This was something that Asta was thinking about, but he would quickly become distracted when he felt something wiggling around in his robe until an anti-bird actually popped out from inside. This was weird. How did he not feel that before? He was confused as to where this bird even came from, and just where were they going? Well, he wouldn't be all that concerned about where the bird was going, more so where did it come from. That's why he was more interested in finding out, because was it really just his adrenaline kicking in at the time? That's why he didn't even notice that a bird was inside of his robe. He was just scratching his head about that part. But the bird would actually come back not too long later with some sort of stone that had weird engravings on it. They would drop it in Asta's hands. He would try to give it back to the villagers, but they would actually insist that Asta keep it. It was meant to basically be their form of gratitude for Asta and the others, essentially saving them from these evil mages. After completing the mission, the group would head back to the Black Bull's hideout, in which Yami would bring up the fact that, hey, they actually did a pretty good enough job out there. Good enough to the point where the Wizard King actually bestowed upon the group a star. They were this much closer to getting out to the negative star territory. Yeah, when Asta first heard that they got a star for their good work, he was honestly really excited until he heard about the negative star territory. territory that apparently the Black Bulls were in. This was apparently because of the amount of destruction the Black Bulls usually ended up doing on their missions, and how they were known for always starting trouble somehow. Asta would falter a little bit hearing that, but his, I don't even know how to say it, but when it comes on to Asta though, Asta wouldn't be deterred for very long. Sure, he may have faltered for a second, but that was only because of the fact that he was surprised to find out that his group was in a negative territory. And Asta just saw this as another stepping stone, another obstacle in his path of becoming Wizard King. He wasn't going to let that get in the way for very long though. He was going to make sure he would break down that wall as soon as possible. And it wouldn't be very long either until they had to do another mission. Yeah, Yami would actually have Noel, Asta, and Luck investigate a dungeon this time around, rather than it just being between Asta, Noel, and Magna. It was a mission that was actually assigned to Black Bulls from, Julius specifically. Asta, he would explore the dungeon with Luck and Noel until the senior Magic Knight decided to start exploring the dungeon on his own. He was more so interested in finding strong opponents to, fight. Asta would have followed. Yeah, but Noel's death glare, that convinced him not to go. Yeah, he figured it was a pretty good idea to just stick with Noel for right now. Luck was also rather fast as well, and he had a feeling the place was booby-trapped. Sure, Asta could fly, but it would be pretty pointless to exhaust his mana reserves, no matter how big they are, just trying to keep up with Luck. Honestly, just sounded like a waste of energy. Yeah, but while exploring the dungeon, Asta and Noel, they would also meet up with members from the Golden Dawn, interestingly enough. Asta and Yuno would immediately greet each other by sending attacks at each other. It was a pretty odd way of greeting each other, which everybody on both sides had to admit, yeah, that was pretty weird. At first they were thinking that these two were enemies, but no. It was just something that these two liked to do. Yuno started off with a gust of wind, which Asta would counter with his own small tornado. Asta really liked tornadoes, and Noel and Mimosa would be confused. Well, mainly because the two going on to shake hands and all, because at first they thought the two had bad blood between each other. When they heard the two brothers shake hands and laugh right after, they would notice the confusion on everybody's faces, and Asta and Yuno would go on to introduce each other to the groups. Asta would introduce Yuno to Noel, while Yuno introduced Asta to Mimosa and Klaus. Klaus, unfortunately, he refused to acknowledge Asta as an equal. He honestly just saw the Black Bull's robe on Asta and immediately figured he was nothing more but a reckless mongrel, just like the other Black Bulls. After all, the Black Bulls had a pretty bad reputation for the longest time. But Asta, he would just roll his eyes at Klaus though. He wouldn't let him bother him that much. He was on a mission after all. He would question why Yuno was here, to which Yuno would actually explain that his team was sent here to explore the dungeon. Asta would mention how his team was sent here as well, interestingly enough. And Klaus, he would butt into this conversation. he would explain that he actually had a very hard time believing that the Black Bulls would be sent on a mission of this caliber coming directly from the Wizard King. It just sounded pretty preposterous. Mimosa would boast about the fact their group managed to get a star on their last mission, to which Noel would also claim that their team did as well, and Klaus would even claim that the Black Bulls were just spouting lies upon lies at this point. Yeah, Asta was quickly getting annoyed with Klaus. He was getting pretty aggravated by this guy constantly saying that Asta was a liar, and then to say that Noel was lying as well. Come on now. Why are you calling everybody liars today? It just seemed that this guy had a pretty big ego or whatever, and Asta, he always had issues with people like that. He needed to just have this guy understand where he really ranked in the totem pole, you could say. This guy needed to understand what reality was really like. And his way of doing this would involve, well, challenging the Glasses wearing Golden Dawn member to a race. Yeah, whoever managed to get to the center of the dungeon, they would be the one to win. Klaus figured that this would be an easy challenge though, and to prove a point about their superiority, would actually accept. The two groups would split up, with each determined to beat the other. Unfortunately, though, Yuno's group would encounter a mage from another kingdom. You see, the thing about this dungeon was that it bordered between the Clover and Diamond Kingdom. That meant mages from either kingdom had free reign when it came on to exploring the dungeon. The Diamond Kingdom mage would actually attack the Clover Kingdom mages, pushing them back, and although Klaus hated to admit it, they were struggling in this fight. This guy was unusually strong with his crystal magic, and in this predicament, Klaus would turn to Yuno. He would order for Yuno to leave and explore the dungeon on his own. Just find a way out of here. Just leave them, but Yuno would attempt to reason with Klaus. This would fall on deaf ears though, and Yuno would realize that it was pointless trying to explain the situation to Klaus, trying to make him understand that he wasn't going to just leave. So of course Yuno would actually attempt to escape Mars, but he would change his mind halfway through. Instead, he decided to stick by his companions and save them from Mars's oncoming attack. Yeah, Mars had just binded one of Klaus's feet, so he wouldn't be able to dodge the next attack he launched. Yuno would manage to block the attack at the very last minute. This would honestly surprise Mars, but he figured that this was just going to be another person to his body count, you could say. Luck, well, he was in a pretty similar situation or position, you could say. You see, he had managed to encounter a Diamond Kingdom mage as well, but this guy, rather than the situation with Mars where he could manipulate crystals or had like crystal magic, this guy seemed to have smoke magic, and the way that he used it was interesting, and where he would basically obscure the vision of Luck most of the time. He had also managed to bind Luck at this point. He was about to actually kill Luck, but Asta would manage to arrive to stop the attack just in time from colliding with Luck. Asta would smirk seeing his teammate be alright, in a pretty safe position. He was just glad that Luck was sort of safe. I wouldn't say completely safe. It's just that he was alive. That was what Asta was glad to see. He would insist that he take over from here, but Luck refused to actually back down. He honestly refused because of the flashbacks to the promise he made to his dying mother. This promise being that he would never lose in a fight. Asta would then suggest that the three of them tag team this guy instead, and Luck, although initially disagree, Asta would bring up the whole part about them being companions, comrades. They're supposed to work together. When one of them isn't strong enough to handle a certain person, that's when your comrades step in to help in that fight. And with that sort of reasoning, that's the only way that not Asta but Luck would actually agree to Asta's with that reasoning, that would be pretty much the only reason why Luck would even go on to actually accept Asta's proposal. With the three Black Bulls working together, they would make quick work of Lotus. While Lotus would try to create more smoke, Asta would simply create gusts of wind that would blow it away, and this would give Luck a clear path to the sky. Asta would also pummel Lotus with hail right after. Noelle would land the finishing attack by throwing a sphere of water at her opponent. She would honestly be pretty ecstatic seeing that it connected this time around, and it had enough force to knock him unconscious. On top of that, Asta would sense that something was wrong though. Yuno's consumption of mana was getting scarily faster. He and his team would go to search for the Golden Dawn members when they found the group. They saw an exhausted Yuno protecting Klaus and Mimosa. He was breathing heavily after using two spells concurrently, only to see that it still wasn't enough to put down Mars. It was only now that he actually pulled out his grimoire, as if to say that now, just now, he was actually starting to take the fight seriously. Yuno would see Asta and smile though. It was about time he showed up. Asta would be angered seeing his brother and his comrades in such a beaten state though. Mars would raise an eyebrow seeing Asta until he felt his magical presence being released. It was suffocating. As a matter of fact, it was so suffocating that his vision was starting to go in and out. He refused to go out like this though, just from a magical presence, you could say. Yuno would chuckle at this though. Yeah, Asta always liked to overdo things. Klaus was also in a state of shock though. This kid, Asta, had that much magic? I mean, sure, he saw this kid create like a small tornado at one point, but he never really thought that much about it at first. But now he would see Asta easily break through Mars' defenses. Despite his exhausted state, would also pick himself up. Seeing his brother only use his fists to break through the enemy's defenses was enough to give Yuno a second wind in the fight as well. Yuno would launch a gust of wind that was powerful enough to throw Mars back. Mars was still in a dazed state from his defenses being broken down by Asta, and the incredible aura that Asta was exuding at this point. Mars, after Yuno's attack now, would have lost his footing. He was now scrambling to his feet, but even then, with Asta's magical presence and the radioactivity that came from it, it was as if he was losing consciousness at a pretty rapid rate right now. He was struggling to even get up right now. With him just losing his footing, it wasn't that easy right now. It was as if one of his feet was asleep, you could say. As soon as he got up though, Asta would be there just to punch him square in the face, and this monstrous strength that came from behind the punch would actually be what will be enough to knock out Mars before he even had the chance to use any other spells. Asta and Yuno's groups would go on to arrive at the treasury later on, in which Yuno would be attracted to a Satan scroll with wind currents surrounding it. Opening this scroll would cause for the text to vanish though and appear in his grimoire instead. That was peculiar. The magical knights would gather a hefty amount of treasure using Asta's storm clouds and Klaus's steel magic chariots. They would recall picking up some magical items, or like you could say magical technology of sorts. These magical artifacts that would boost somebody's magical capabilities tenfold sometimes. And Asta would recall even seeing a sword being picked up at one point as well. It was weird looking, but he figured that he would just give it up to Julius, the Wizard King, or something later on. He wasn't really thinking that much about the treasure itself. Well, maybe besides like using some of that money in order to give back to Hargate Village. But beyond that, he wasn't really thinking that much about it. He pretty much overlooked everything that was in that dungeon. More mages from the Diamond Kingdom would actually attempt to attack the Black Bulls and Golden Dawn though, and steal the treasure, but they would be knocked out almost immediately after. With the amount of treasure each group managed to provide, another star would be added to their rankings, and a feast would be held by Yami for the success of the most recent mission. At least when it came on to Asta, Noel, and Luck. Yami would then order to have Asta and Noel go give a report of the mission to the Magic Knights headquarters pretty much a week later. And this would have also been when he realized that, oh snap, these guys are telling me, oh, I need to have these guys given a report, because apparently nobody told Asta and Noel that they needed to report their missions. Honestly, Yami was just facepalming when he realized that he should have told them from earlier on, but it was no big deal. It wasn't his problem. It wasn't that much our problem. It was more so their issue, more so their problem, Asta and Noel. He would just send them over to the Magical Knights headquarters, and along the way, the two would encounter the Golden Dawn squad that was with them during the mission. Obviously, Yuno, Klaus, and Mimosa. When reporting their findings, Julius would immediately be interested in their magic types and just exactly what they found during the mission, these magical items, all that sort. And Julius would be disappointed though in the fact that Yuno didn't know what the writing that suddenly appeared in his grimoire said, or how to even use it. He would be intrigued with Asta's magic and strength though. His strength reminded him somewhat of Wergolion's sister, Meriliona. The big difference between these two though was that Asta seemed to have a more laid-back personality. That wasn't really saying much though, considering Merilion's incredibly fiery fiery and feisty personality. The ability to create and control storms was incredibly terrifying as well, though. These kids, oh geez, yeah, these kids were going to be monsters in the future. But while looking through the magical items found in the dungeon, though, Julius would become curious of the sword they found there. It looked rather rusty and clad in dirt until he picked it up. When Julius tried to pick it up, he would realize that it was rather heavy and it was draining his mana as well. Asta would try to pick it up himself, and although it was still pretty heavy, he was actually able to grasp it properly. Julius would find this sword to be rather odd with how it drained mana. He assumed it was a magical item, but a pretty peculiar magical item. Most magical items were meant to enhance your magic, not drain it. Was there something else to this magic then? To this magic item? He wasn't really sure. He would also look over to Asta, and while Asta was able to wield the sword, it was still technically draining mana from him. It just didn't seem to faze Asta as much with how large his reserves were. He would insist that Asta keep the sword though, considering how it could help him in his battles moving forward. Asta would nod his head in agreement, and he would place the sword within his grimoire. Julius would then invite all of them to a ceremony for the magic knights that rewarded them for their hard work. Seeing the many mages and their accomplishments they managed to make would motivate Asta to work even harder for his goal of becoming Wizard King. And during the after party, Asta would be enamored by the amount of food there. It was honestly way more than he had ever seen in his whole entire life. And he was honestly about to break down and cry because, well, this was going to be one of the few times when he actually got to eat something beyond potatoes. And of course, this was outside of the Black Bulls, because once he joined the Black Bulls, he actually got to eat some more foods. But even then, it was nothing in comparison to this, except for whenever Charmy cooked. That's it. That was pretty much the only comparison that he could make at this point. Asta, he would get stared down though by several magical knights coming from nobility. They saw Asta as nothing more than just a vile creature with the way he ate. They considered it to be so uncivilized. Asta, though, he would pay them no mind until he noticed that Noelle was being cornered by two people who seemed to be related to her, at least judging by their facial features. They had similar facial features to Noelle and their hair color as well, but the hair color was a bit of a stretch, you could say, because of the fact that he had to admit that not everybody who had the same hair color as another person was related in one way or form. It just could be a coincidence, but the fact that they had similar facial features would imply something else. Imply that they had some sort of relation. And he would then suddenly see Noelle begin to cry. She just started to break down crying, and once Asta realized what was going on, he would explode in anger. He knew exactly what was going on here, and he would approach Nebra and Solid with his magical aura flaring up subconsciously. The two siblings of Noelle would begin to sweat the closer the aura approached them. It wasn't nearly as powerful as it was when he was fighting against Mars, but this aura, it was still incredibly suffocating to the point where they were starting to go in and out of consciousness. Many other mages were suffering from the same issue. The weaker mages would even collapse at this point, and just going off of Asta's immense aura. Asta would call them out when he was close enough. Everybody was staring at them now. It became deadly silent at this point. Nebra and Solid, they would turn around to face Asta, but once they saw that he was just one of the commoners turned magic knights, the two would relax a little. They didn't think much of Asta, and they would tell him to actually scram. These were family affairs that a commoner, well, had no business being a part of. Asta would rebuttal their argument though by explaining that they made his teammate cry, and therefore it was his business now as well. Nebra and Solid would grow annoyed with Asta and decide to show him his place, albeit hesitantly with his aura's intensity. Asta would negate their attacks almost immediately though by creating a whirlwind. He would begin to charge up lightning in his hands as well to strike at the two of them, but another magic knight would try to sneak attack him. Asta would form storm clouds of a great amount of density in order to bounce off of, avoiding the attack. Asta would dodge several attacks from the other magical knights before eventually deciding to try out his new sword against them. He would find himself being able to absorb some of the spells used by the magical knights, and he would just redirect it back at them. Leopold Vermilion, the youngest sibling of the Vermilion household, would see what Asta was capable of and become pumped at this moment. He would try his hand at fighting Asta one day, but he wanted it to be a 1v1 rather than a battle royale. He wanted to really know how he really was compared to Asta. How did he scale? And he wouldn't be able to get a proper read until it was a 1v1. Nozel and Regolion would be the ones to stop the madness though in the end. Well, more so Regolion. You see, Nozel, he was about ready to have a whole fade with Asta. I'm gonna be completely honest. He wanted to show this commoner his place by fighting him and just taking him down immediately for messing with his siblings, but Regolion would actually calm Nozel down. He would go into Asta's direction and comment on how he was impressed by Asta's strength as well. The kid had a lot of potential with how he was already squaring up against scrims of magical knights and holding his own until the very end. Asta would still be rather on edge here, but he was doing his best to calm down, now that Regolion calmed everyone else down. That was until someone bunched into the banquet hall to inform them of a strange occurrence that was happening outside. You see, apparently there was something along the lines of zombies attacking the capital. This was highly unusual, and Asta would immediately rush outside to see for himself, before Nozel could even stop him to discuss a plan with the other magical knights. But this is where I'm going to end it for right now, and as you guys can see, it's already pretty long. So yeah, I really got nothing else to say. Besides, if you liked the video, hit the like button. If you've been rocking with my content for a while now, maybe hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and share. But yeah, check the description. And yeah, I have nothing else to say. It's your boy King Ty Next signing out. Peace.